4. Wilson and the War. If the contract with Jewry was to bring the United States into the Great War in exchange for the promise of Palestine, did they in fact deliver, through Brandeis or anyone else? For the German Jewish princes of the purse in the United States, the evidence points more to the Russian Revolution being the factor of most weight in determining their attitude. Was it the resumption of Germany's submarine blockade, the sinking of the Laconia, the Zimmermann telegram, which really influenced Wilson for war? Was it the Zionist Council of Brandeis? In the careful study, Professor Alex Emarnit showed in 1937 that Wilson had decided to put the United States into the war on the side of the Allies many months before the resumption of U-boat warfare by Germany, which was promoted as a sufficient reason. In the propaganda battle for American public opinion between Britain and Germany, the former had the advantage of language, and the fact that on the 5th of August 1914 they had cut the international undersea cables linking Germany and the United States, thus eliminating quick communication between those two countries and giving British news the edge in forming public opinion. The success of British propaganda methods were acknowledged by a German soldier of the time when he dictated his memoirs, Mein Kampf, in 1925. In England, propaganda was regarded as a weapon of the first order, whereas with us it represented the last hope of a livelihood for our unemployed politicians and a snug jobs for shirkers of the modest heroic type. Taken all in all, its results were negative. British propaganda portrayed the war as one of just defense against a barbarian aggressor akin to the hordes of Genghis Khan, who were rapers of nuns, mutilators of children, led by the Kaiser, pictured as a beast in human form, a lunatic, deformed monster, modern Judas, and criminal monarch. Stories that German soldiers cut off the hands of Belgian children and crucified prisoners and perpetrated and all sorts of other atrocities said to have been practiced in Belgium, were circulated as widely as possible. The story about their making glycerin and soap from corpses did not appear until the end of April 1917, when news stories were created by American propagandists. 1. A book called Christine, by Alice Coleman Lee, a collection of letters purporting to have been written by a teenage girl music student to her mother in Britain until her death in 1914, mingled a damning catalogue of alleged German character faults with emotional feelings for her fictitious mother and music. Propaganda experts rated it highly. The head of the American section of the British Propaganda Bureau, Sir Gilbert Parker, was able to report on his success in the issue of his secret American Press Review for the 11th of October 1916 before the presidential election. This week supplies satisfactory evidence of the permeation of the American press by British influence. Men of British ancestry still dominated the powerful infrastructure of the economy, filled top positions in the State Department, in the influential Eastern universities, in the communications and cultural media. Britain and France were more identified with democracy and freedom, and the Central Powers with imperial militaristic autocracy. From Oyster Bay, former President Theodore Roosevelt, recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, performed high-pitched war dances of words in support of belligerency. But at the Democratic Convention, and in the subsequent campaign, it was William Jennings Bryan and his allied orators who created the theme and slogan, "He kept us out of war." Bryan had resigned as Secretary of State in June 1915 because he believed Wilson was jeopardizing American neutrality and showing partiality towards England. In his last interview, he told Wilson bitterly, "Colonel House has been Secretary of State, not I, and I have never had your full confidence." House, a secretive and subtle flatterer who had performed services relating to the Federal Reserve Bank and currency legislation for Jacob W. Schiff and Paul Warburg, was perceived by Wilson as the friend who so thoroughly understands me, my second personality, my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. Bryan had wanted to go on a peace mission to Europe at the beginning of 1915, but the president sent House instead. House had actually sailed on the British ship Lusitania, and as it approached the Irish coast on the 5th of February, the captain ordered the American flag to be raised. The intimate papers of Colonel House record that on the morning of the 7th of May 1915, he and the British Foreign Secretary Grey drove to Kew. We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, recorded House, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would in itself probably carry us into the war. An hour later, House was with King George in Buckingham Palace. We fell to talking. Strangely enough, the Colonel wrote that night, of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner. He said, suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board. That evening House dined at the American embassy. A dispatch came in, stating that at 2 in the afternoon a German submarine had torpedoed and sunk the Lusitania off the southern coast of Ireland. 1,200 lives were lost, including 128 Americans. It took 60 years for the truth about its cargo to be confirmed, that it had carried munitions which exploded when the torpedo hit. But Secretary of State Bryan remarked to his wife, "I wonder if that ship carried munitions of war. If she did carry them, it puts a different face on the whole matter. England has been using our citizens to protect her ammunition." In a telegram to President Wilson from England on the 9th of May 1915, House said he believed an immediate demand should be made to Germany for assurance against a similar incident. "I should inform her that our government expected to take measures to ensure the safety of American citizens. If war follows, it will not be a new war, but an endeavor to end more speedily an old one. Our intervention will save, rather than increase loss of life. We can no longer be neutral spectators." In another telegram on the 25th of May, he noted that he had received from Ambassador Gerard a cable that Germany is in no need of food. This does away with their contention that the starving of Germany justified their submarine policy. The next day, House lunched with Sir Edward Grey and read him all the telegrams that had passed between the President, Gerard and himself since last they had met. And he wrote on the 30th of May 1915, "I have concluded that war with Germany is inevitable, and this afternoon at 6 o'clock I decided to go home on the SS St. Paul on Saturday. I sent a cable to the President to this effect." After his arrival in the United States, he wrote to the President from Roslyn, Long Island, on the 16th of June 1915, a long letter which included the paragraph, "I need not tell you that if the Allies fail to win, it must necessarily mean a reversal of our entire policy. I think we shall find ourselves drifting into war with Germany. Regrettable as this would be, there would be compensations. The war would be more speedily ended, and we would be in a strong position to aid the other great democracies in turning the world into the right paths. It is something that we have to face with fortitude, being consoled by the thought that no matter what sacrifices we make, the end will justify them. Affectionately yours, E. M. House." Are these references related to Zionism or Palestine? I think not. Perhaps the clue is that immediately after the election of Wilson, House had anonymously published a political romance entitled Philip Drew, Administrator. Drew leads a revolt and becomes a dictator in Washington, where he formulates a new American Constitution and brings about an international grouping or League of Powers. Let us look to the other side of the water again in 1916, a year later. About a month before Malcolm's meeting with Sir Mark Sykes, Lloyd George gave an interview to the president of the United Press Association of America, in which he said that Britain had only now got into her stride in her war effort, and was justifiably suspicious of any suggestion that President Wilson should choose this moment to butt in with a proposal to stop the war before we could achieve victory. The whole world must know that there can be no outside interference at this stage. Britain asked no intervention when she was unprepared to fight. She will tolerate none now that she is prepared, until the Prussian military despotism is broken beyond repair. The motto of the Allies was never again. And this made worthwhile the sacrifices so far as well as those needed to end the war with victory. Grey wrote to him on the 29th of September that he was apprehensive about the effect of the warning to Wilson in your interview. It has always been my view that until the Allies were sure of victory the door should be kept open for Wilson's mediation. But the following month, at one of the formal regular meetings with the Chief of the Imperial Staff, When Lloyd George received the familiar answers as to the course of the war, the German losses were greater than the Allies, that the Germans were gradually being worn down, and their morale shaken by constant defeat and retreat, he asked Sir William Robertson for his views as to how this sanguinary conflict was to be brought to a successful end. He just mumbled something about attrition. Lloyd George then asked for a formal memorandum on the subject. This was not encouraging, and said that an end could not be expected before the summer of 1918. How long it may go on afterwards I cannot even guess. The facts were far from rosy, but were the hopes of Great Britain really hanging upon American entry into the war? There were two other possible courses. One was suggested by the Marquis of Lansdowne, a member of the cabinet and a statesman of considerable standing, as the author of the Entente Cordiale in 1904. It was contained in a memorandum respecting a peace settlement, circulated to the cabinet with the consent of the Prime Minister. Lansdowne suggested doubts as to the possibility of victory within a reasonable space of time. What does the prolongation of the war mean? Our own casualties already amount to over 1,100,000. We have had 15,000 officers killed, not including those who are missing. There is no reason to suppose that, as the force at the front in the different theaters of war increases, the casualties will increase at a lower rate. We are slowly but surely killing off the best of the male population of these islands. The figures representing the casualties of our allies are not before me. The total must be appalling. The other members of the cabinet and the chief of staff repudiated peace without victory. The other course was that adopted, to thrust more men and money into the Holocaust, defined as a wholesale sacrifice or destruction. What would now be called political and military summit meetings were held in France to plan for it. They commenced on the 15th of November 1916. In the political presentations, the only reference to America seems to have been offered by Lloyd George. The difficulties we have experienced in making payment for our purchases abroad must be as present to the minds of French statesmen as to ourselves. Our dependence upon America is growing for food, raw material and munitions. We are rapidly exhausting the securities negotiable in America. If victory shone on our banners, our difficulties would disappear. Asquith deleted the next sentence, which read, "Success means credit. Financiers never hesitate to lend to a prosperous concern, but business which is lumbering along amidst great difficulties and which is making no headway in spite of enormous expenditure will find the banks gradually closing their books against it." This reference to allied problems in getting more credit from the bankers in the United States, who are predominantly German Jewish, elucidates Schiff's agreement to arrange credit for Britain through the Jewish banker Kassel. They were not waiting for a Balfour Declaration, they were waiting for the Russian Revolution. On the military side, there was general agreement at the summit conference that what was needed was a knockout blow, and it was decided that the 1917 plan of campaign would be an offensive on all fronts, including Palestine, with the Western Front as the principal one. On the 7th of December the Asquith government fell and Lloyd George, who was pledged to a more vigorous prosecution of the war, took over the government. 5 days later, Germany and her allies put forward notes in which they stated their willingness to consider peace by compromise and negotiations. The first of the battles opened on the 9th of April 1917, heralded by a bombardment of 2,700,000 shells. Another attack was launched by the French 9 days later, these resulting in about 1 million dead and wounded on both sides. The French army mutinied, and General Pétain was put in charge. At this time the two events which were to twist the world into a new shape were occurring: the Russian Revolution and American entry into the war. French government wanted to defer all offensive operations until American assistance became available, but the generals thought otherwise. Major General J.F.C. Fuller, whom I have met, one of the few bright military political minds in this century, tells us that Haig had set his heart on a decisive battle in Flanders, and so obsessed was he by it that he believed that he could beat the Germans single-handed, and before the Americans came in. I do not think that people who did not live in the great days of the British Empire can have a sense of the hubris of a Haig, unless one gets it from classical literature. Perhaps today it would be found in the head of the World Bank, from whom we taxpayers, like the common soldiers of that time, are so far removed. There was actually resentment in the England of my boyhood about Americans claiming to have played any significant part in fighting the Great War. The outcome of the grandiosity of the generals and politicians was the costly Flanders campaign of the summer and autumn. On the 7th of June it was opened by the limited and successful Battle of Messines, which was preceded by a 17 days bombardment of 3,500,000 shells, and initiated by the explosion of 19 mines packed with £1 million of high explosives. On the 31st of July it was followed by the Third Battle of Ypres, for which the largest force of artillery ever seen in British history was assembled. In all, the preliminary bombardment lasted 19 days, and during it 4,300,000 shells, some 107,000 tons in weight, were hurled onto the prospective low-lying battlefield. Its entire surface was upheaved, all drains, dikes, culverts and roads were destroyed, and an almost uncrossable swamp created, in which the infantry wallowed for 3.5 months. When, on the 10th of November, the battle ended, the Germans had been pushed back a maximum depth of 5 miles on the frontage of 10 miles, at a cost of a little under 200,000 men to themselves, and, at the lowest estimate, of 300,000 to their enemy. Thus ended the last of the great artillery battles of attrition on the Western Front, and when in retrospect they are looked on, it becomes understandable why the politicians were so eager to escape them. The Great War was like a greatly magnified version of the mutual destruction of noble men in the Nibelungenlied. Set against each other by the vanity and lack of vision of their rulers, the more they fought the more there was to avenge until death delivered them from their need. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we should learn their lesson.